executive director at the Albemarle Charlottesville Historical Society at the Charlottesville Center for History and Culture. I got a call from the board in the spring to come try to turn around an organization that I care about very much. Many decades ago, I was a volunteer tour guide when I was in grad school at UVA, when I fell in love with Charlottesville and its story, and I would drag third graders up and down the mall and tell them about the history of Charlottesville and loved every minute of it. And now I get to figure out how can we, as a community, really reinvent and reimagine what a local history group can do. One that is, deeply inclusive, deeply diverse, and is absolutely committed to those principles. And that's what guides us. I believe that history isn't the past. It's not. The past happened. It will never happen again. It is done. History is the network of stories that we tell each other and our children about the past. The past never changes. But history, if you do it right, it does change. Because we learn more about the past. Because we invite more people to tell their story. And we're willing to listen to more people tell their stories about the past. And I believe that to my core, that is absolutely the most critical part of our mission. Is not to empower others to tell their story, but to listen and to share these stories. So one of the things we're doing is we are creating all new community events. These events are entirely free. They're open to everyone. I promote them as best I can on Facebook, on radio, on TV, and email blasts. This sign-up list that's going around, that's all that's for. I'm not selling your email. That is entirely just to give you word about events that we have coming up. This is the last public event that we're doing for this calendar year. We'll start up again in January. I'll be doing a talk in this space. And I like this space because it's got the parking and it's downtown and it's mostly convenient for most folks. But I'll be doing a talk in here about the 200th anniversary of UVA, which is actually the third week in January, is the actual anniversary of the 200th, when Central College became UVA. And I do a whole, with PowerPoint, a whole in-depth backstory about how it happened. And Dr. Preston Reynolds will be doing a talk for us next semester about eugenics at the University of Virginia. Dan Bluestone is coming back from Boston University for a weekend to give a couple of talks for us and a tour. So we're looking forward to that. And also next year we're doing an entirely new exhibit with Phyllis, who will speak in just a few minutes.
Thank you.
About the history of the Jewish community of Charlottesville. And that'll be on exhibit in our exhibit hall at our building. Where is your building? We look right at Lee. You can't make this stuff up. The Historical Society looks right at Lee. You know, look out my office. I mean, that's confrontation, right? It's just amazing. But we are in what was the 1921 public library for whites. And it's a gorgeous building. We're right behind the main library on Market Street. And we're very happy to be there. And hopefully the city will renew our lease. We'll see. We're very excited about where we're going. My dream is to build a new museum of history and culture for Charlottesville so that we can tell our story. For a long time, we've been under two big shadows, Monticello and UVA. But it's time we told our story to the world. And the world is listening to Charlottesville, like it or not. We're a hashtag. We're one of those towns. And that's one thing we're going to talk about tonight. If there's any one event that we're doing this year that I am so proud of and so excited of, it's tonight. And I'm really glad you're here because this is an important moment. And I'm so honored to be able to help put this together. My belief is that history can enrich our lives and that we can use it as a tool to inform some of the difficult conversations that we must have. And I think this community, of all communities in the world right now, really needs a strong civic organization that is dedicated to bringing people together and putting them in a room and having some difficult conversations about some very difficult subjects and letting history inform those conversations. And that's what we're going to do tonight. I have worked with Phyllis Leffler for a long time. I am a great fan and admirer of the work that she does, and she has long been an inspiration to me and the history work that I do. And Phyllis recently joined our board as a board of directors. Oh, by the way, we really need your help. If you can help us. I don't charge for any of these events. There's no money changing hands. But if you can take a moment for the end of the year to go on our website, sevillecenter.org, just give us a few bucks. I can't express to you how far I will make every dollar go. So Phyllis recently joined our board. She's been working on the story of the Jewish community in Charlottesville for a long time. She's the expert. And when we were talking about this talk tonight, she said, I could do a history talk. I've done that before. It's an incredible story of the Jews in Charlottesville and their leadership and the impact that they've had in this community. It's really profound, and it's an amazing story that most people don't know. But then Phyllis said, I can do that history, but I'm more interested in connecting the history to address some of the stuff that's going on in the country. Horrific, sad, tragic stuff. And some of that happened right here. And we ask ourselves, just to wrap up here, I'll tell you really quick, I was teaching at UVA after August of 2017. And I had a couple of young women in my class who were Jewish. And they were brought to tears in the classroom telling me, they said that when those crazy guys were walking on the lawn, they were screaming, "Jews will not replace us." What did that have to do with the Confederate statues? Why were they screaming about me? And then they were like, why is no one talking about them? She said, I need healing too. It's important to me. I need this community to talk about me right now, because I'm hurt too. So I hope that's what we can do tonight with one of the best historians we have in this town, who knows this subject matter. Ladies and gentlemen, Dr. Phyllis Leffler. Yeah, let me turn the mic up. I can hear you. I'm going to dim this a little bit so it's easier for you to see the screen.
So thanks to all of you for being here tonight. I'm really honored to be here as a representative of the Albemarle Charlottesville Historical Society. I am a huge fan of what COI has been doing to rehabilitate the society. And for me, it's really an honor to be on the board as one of the representatives of the city and to participate in the activities of the newly formed Albemarle Charlottesville Historical Society by being able to give this talk tonight. So I'm going to move quickly into this talk. I hope I can deliver just a little bit of what COI has promised, and also to leave time for a broader discussion, which I think would be very, very valuable. In my talk today, I focus on the history of the Jews of Charlottesville. I call it, as you can see, Privilege or Prejudice. I might have also titled this talk, Understanding Difference, or The Place of Minorities, or The Ambiguity of Race in Charlottesville. The rest of my title, Charlottesville's Jews, Anti-Semitism, and White Supremacy, sounds a bit edgier and more confrontational, and suggests that Jews have been a persecuted minority. But then there's also that word, privilege, in my title, which suggests quite a different story. So tonight, I invite you to take a journey with me, a journey that begins with the summer of 2017, but that also goes back in time to explore the longer history of Jews, first in the town and then the city of Charlottesville. Through this talk, I want to explore the larger question of the place of Jews in this city that I love and call home. I do believe that this history can be seen as a microcosm of the Jewish experience regionally and often nationally. So let me begin with some hard data. The number of Jews in Charlottesville, Albemarle County today is approximately 1,500 out of a total population of 155,000. Throughout the 20th and now 21st centuries, the population of Jews in Charlottesville has never constituted more than 1%, and sometimes far less. Now we are about 1.1% in Virginia. That certainly suggests minority status, just in sheer numbers. With the little bit of research that I did as I was preparing this talk, I discovered that the Muslim population of our region seems to be around 3%, the Latino Hispanic 11%, Asian 13%, and African American 20%. So we Jews definitely constitute a tiny minority. As a minority and throughout world history, Jews have often found themselves cast out of their countries of origin and or subject to discrimination, attack, murder, and even genocide, merely because of their religious beliefs. At the same time, Jews have occupied some of the highest positions within their societies, and the United States, above all, has often been viewed as the ultimate place of opportunity for Jews in a multi-religious society. American Jewish history has been written as a story of unmitigated success, where 60% of Jews have completed college or graduate school, and earned incomes are higher than any other religious group in the country. So, when we look at the history of Charlottesville, what can we say about the place of Jews both historically and currently? Have Jews been insiders or outsiders here? Are they privileged as white with economic and educational advantages, or are they subject to prejudice because of their religious minority status? These questions rise to a greater level of urgency than they might have prior to 2016, because we in Charlottesville are still grappling with our collective understanding of the events of August 11th, 12th, 2017, in which the Unite the Right rally participants chanted, carried vile anti-Semitic slogans, beat counter-protesters, and caused the death of Heather Heyer. So that raises the question, was this experience familiar to Charlottesville's Jews, or was it an aberration? First, I think we need to understand a little bit better what happened on August 11th and 12th and what motivated it. On those days, the city and the world witnessed the unleashing of hatred and violence based upon philosophies of white nationalism and white supremacy. Those views were stoked by the unleashing of a permission to hate the other, the outsiders, including immigrant populations. Of course, we know also, those of us in Charlottesville who've been following this, we know that August was preceded by rallies in both May and May and July of 2017, and that anti-Semitism was also on display there. This is an image from the July events when the Klan gathered. But August became the best remembered of them, and Charlottesville has become an international meme. I don't think there's a day that goes by when I don't continue to see some reference to Charlottesville, and everybody seems to understand what that means. So Charlottesville has become an international meme for hatred, violence, disruption of civil society, and even death unleashed by the forces of the alt-right in America. Hatred, violence, death. In August, leaders Jason Kessler and Richard Spencer and their followers spouted the rhetoric that ties them directly to an international movement of neo-Nazi groups. In these views, white nationalism, white supremacy, racism, and anti-Semitism share common ground. I want to say that again because that's a major theme of what I want to talk about tonight. White nationalism, white supremacy, racism, and anti-Semitism share common ground. In August of 2017, there were direct references to Hitler, with people chanting Heil Hitler, blood and soil, T-shirts with Hitler quotes, and direct references to the Holocaust with cries on Friday, something I just learned, cries on Friday of the Tiki Torch marchers of "To the Ovens," as well as "Jews will not replace us." When the forces of the alt-right gathered in Charlottesville ostensibly to protest the removal of Confederate statues that had been erected in the 1920s as part of the commemoration of the lost cause, those issues became conflated with issues of purity and whiteness, and Jews were cast as global conspirators engaged in despoiling a pure white America. The banners announcing the rally make this perfectly clear. I'm not sure that all of you have seen some of these announcements prior to the actual rally itself. This one that says, "Unite the right to end Jewish influence in America," and wow. This one that actually says "a pivotal movement for the pro-white movement in America," with these very Aryan-looking figures and the claim, "You will not replace us." In the slogans, "Jews will not replace us" or "You will not replace us," the reference is clearly to the non-white other, which in addition to Jews includes Muslims, blacks, Latinos, immigrants writ large. Just as we have seen in the fear-mongering currently associated with the caravan issue that motivated the mass murder in Pittsburgh at the Tree of Life Synagogue less than a month ago, on August 27th. There's a long history, both in the United States and in Western Europe, when Jews were defined as a race and considered non-white. In such times when these views emerge, Jews feel vulnerable and targeted. It always seems to be worse in areas where Jews are a tiny minority and can be singled out. And although Southern Jews in the United States often ended up on the white side of the color line in the early 19th century, that began to change with the confluence of Reconstruction and the immigration of East European Jews in later decades. Jews were considered a racial type. As fears of, quote, invisible blackness spread, Jews could be and were stereotyped for their curly hair, facial features, and swarthy complexions. And lots of books were even written with specious science to prove this in the late 19th and 20th centuries. Here's one such book that was incredibly popular called The Jew a Negro, being a study of Jewish ancestry from an impartial standpoint. Very impartial, right. So anti-Semitism was part of the racism that set Jews apart, led to discrimination, and its most extreme in Germany, to mass genocide. This is what was on the minds of so many Jewish people in Charlottesville when the Nazis came to town in August of 2017. And just to make that a little bit more clear about the vulnerability and shock that the Jewish community felt, I want to share with you parts of a blog that was written by the president of Congregation Beth Israel in the days immediately following. I think most people who are not a part of the Jewish community will not have seen this, but I think it does help us to understand how the events were perceived from within the Jewish community. So this is from Alan Zimmerman, who is president of the congregation and head of the CBI Board of Directors. He wrote, "On Saturday morning, I stood outside our synagogue with the armed security guard we hired after the police department refused to provide us with an officer during morning services. Even the police department's limited promise of an observer near our building was not kept. And note, we did not ask for protection of our property, only our people as they worshiped. 40 congregants were inside. Here's what I witnessed during that time. For half an hour, 3 men, dressed in fatigues and armed with semi-automatic rifles, stood across the street from the temple. Several times, parades of Nazis passed our building, shouting, 'There's the synagogue,' followed by chants of Sig Heil and other anti-Semitic language. Some carried flags with swastikas and other Nazi symbols. Later that day, I arrived on the scene shortly after the car plowed into peaceful protesters. It was a horrific and bloody scene. Soon we learned that Nazi websites had posted a call to burn our synagogue. I sat with one of our rabbis and wondered whether we should go back to the temple to protect the building. What could I do if I were there? Fortunately, it was just talk, but we had already deemed such an attack within the realm of possibilities, taking the precautionary step of removing our Torahs, including a Holocaust scroll, from the premises. This is in America in 2017. I spend this time on the events of August 2017 because I find that while we Jews are well aware of the anti-Semitism of those days, many others are not. It has largely dropped off the radar screen. Within Charlottesville, while we await the outcome of court decisions on the removal of Confederate statues, the focus has turned to the institutional racism that leads to racial inequities and needs ongoing focus and corrective policies and actions. And while I agree that this is where our attention needs to be, I think we should also all be aware of how narrowly defined notions of white nationalism affect all of us, and how anti-Semitism was, and perhaps still is, a part of institutional racism, both in Europe and the United States. We thought it was gone, but perhaps it is not. So now I'd like to go back in time and ask the question, has this been the experience of Jews in Charlottesville and Albemarle over time? And to answer the question, I want to look at some specific moments that help us to understand the history of this community. I want to argue that Jews are both insiders and outsiders to the life of this city, as anti-Semitism ebbs and flows in direct relationship to the virulence of white supremacy and racism. At times, Jews were welcomed and integrated into the political and economic life of the community, and there's a very, very uplifting story to tell there. At times, they were excluded from the University of Virginia and area social clubs and neighborhoods. At times, they were targeted with vandalism and personal threats. Jewish history, both in Charlottesville and elsewhere, is both a story of survival and discrimination, of privilege and prejudice. So So let's turn to a few examples. The first one I'm going to really try to speak of very quickly, but I want to go back to the colonial era, because we do know that there were Jews in Virginia and Jews in Charlottesville from very, very early on, certainly from the late 18th century. And particularly in Charlottesville, the numbers were in the tiny, tiny digits. Not enough people to create a community of Jews, not enough people to form a synagogue. Although there was a synagogue that existed in Richmond as early as 1789, and we do know that Charlottesville's Jews who had ties to family in Richmond did go back and forth to Richmond. It would have been a pretty long trip, but I guess they made it when necessary. There's one prominent merchant that I want to mention very quickly, whose name was David Isaacs. And David Isaacs came to Charlottesville in the 1790s. Charlottesville and Virginia was Jews in Charlottesville and Virginia benefited from Thomas Jefferson's commitment to the principles of the separation of church and state and to the concept of freedom of conscience, which were enshrined in the Virginia Statute for Religious Freedom of 1786. This afforded Jews legal protections for the practice of their religion, and it made Charlottesville a fairly comfortable place for Jews to reside and to conduct business. But David Isaacs, as I said, came in the 1790s, and Jefferson had business dealings with Isaacs. That's what makes him very interesting. Business dealings with Isaacs and with some other Jewish merchants in town who lived here. In addition to selling Jefferson's overseer a ball of twine that was used to lay out the contours of the university, Isaacs provided Jefferson with such basic provisions as meat, butter, cheese, wax, fish, and even a horse. Perhaps even more relevant, he obtained for Jefferson books and pamphlets on the Jewish faith. And these are just some excerpts from letters that went back and forth between the two of them. Really, what's interesting about Isaac's personal history is not just his dealings with Jefferson, but that he had a common law wife named Nancy West, referred to in the literature as a mulatto woman, and they occupied side-by-side houses on Main Street, and they birthed 7 children together. Nancy West sold cakes, had some sort of a bakery, but she also had substantial real estate holdings. And by 1850, she was considered to be one of the wealthiest non-white person in Albemarle County. This relationship seems to have sort of existed under the radar screen of any authorities and engendered benign neglect. And we don't know very much about it, but one of the things that I think is interesting, that a historian named Josh Rothman, who's written extensively about the colonial period and relationships across the color line, he claims that perhaps this relationship occasioned such benign neglect because, he says, of the, quote, cultural marginality and social prejudice experienced by both Jews and blacks. West moved into Isaac's dwelling around 1820 and started to run her bakery out of that building. And then the tolerance ended, the tolerance of this relationship. In fact, the Albemarle County Court grand jury brought charges against the couple in 1822 for illicit sex. And it went through multiple courts over time, and ultimately charges were dismissed, but they were harassed for 5 years. I don't know how typical that would have been, or atypical, but it is one of the few colonial stories of Jewish history that we have, so I thought I would share that with you. This, incidentally, is, I don't know if you can see that very well, this is sort of a street map of Charlottesville, and in the, I think the 1830s. And you can see all of these that I've marked out, it's not too clear, were both the West and Isaac's properties. So they owned close to 2 whole blocks of property on Main Street in Charlottesville. But let's move on, because I think the story gets much more interesting in the mid-19th to early 20th centuries, from about the 1840s to the 1920s. By the mid-19th century, the landscape did begin to change in Charlottesville for Jews, because the first intact families came to Charlottesville in the 1840s and 1850s. And those families were the Lettermans, the Oberdorfers, and the Kaufmans. This picture of Mortimer Kaufman is the second generation Kaufman, because we don't seem to have an extant picture of his father, who was named Moses. So a major part of the storied history of Charlottesville's 19th century centers around these 3 really remarkable families. Each one of them produced about 10 or 12 children. They fought in the Civil War. As best we can tell, they fought on the Confederate side. They were involved in the business life of the city. The first of the retail stores on Main Street in 1852 was the Letterman store. And it grew to be about the single largest retail store Charlottesville had ever seen. Then there was the Kaufman store. This is a photo from 1913, and the Oberdorfer store, a photo from 1916. These were, by far and away, the largest department stores in the city at the time. So they were involved in the business life of the city and prospered and did really well. They were also involved in the civic life of the city. They served on the town council and later city council, sometimes as president. Moses Letterman, for example, was president. They helped create the first Chamber of Commerce in 1888. Hannah Letterman helped found the Ladies' Aid and Temperance Societies. Moses Kaufman and later his son Mortimer Kaufman were on the school board. Mortimer's role was so important that on the day of his funeral, the schools closed in order to honor his role. All of them were involved in leadership roles in democratic politics in the city. And one story I cannot resist telling is that apparently there was such a strong effort to draft Moses Kaufman to serve on the city council that he felt compelled to put a notice in the Daily Progress in 1887 urging people not to vote for him. The cultural life of the city of Charlottesville was also enriched by the Levy family. So I think many of you probably know this story. Commodore Uriah P. Levy, a New Yorker, in fact, who only came to Charlottesville in the summers, purchased Monticello in 1834, and his mother, Rachel Levy, lived there permanently while he came more briefly to visit. After the Civil War, but not until 1897, his nephew, Jefferson Monroe Levy, looking very dapper, right? Jefferson Monroe Levy bought the property and actually lived there 4 months of the year during the summers. He purchased in the late 1880s and refurbished the Levy Opera House in the late 1880s, and in order to help run the Opera House, he hired Jake Letterman and Ernest Oberdorfer, the sons of the founding families. So there was clearly some connections there. Jake Letterman went on to purchase the Jefferson Theater, or the Jefferson Auditorium, and convert it from a bank to a musical venue. And then in 1907, that same Jake Letterman opened a spectacular amusement park at the end of the trolley line in what is now Fry Springs. But he so overextended himself in doing this that it really didn't last for very long. Nonetheless, there was the effort to create a place for popular amusement for the city of Charlottesville. And Saul Kaufman, another one of the Kaufman sons, was one of the founding members of the Charlottesville Municipal Band. So clearly, Charlottesville's Jews were deeply involved in the civic and cultural life of the city. It appears that through this whole period of time, Jews were welcomed, embraced, and valued as they integrated themselves into the life of the city. They were largely distinguished German Jews who I would say were really insiders to the life of Charlottesville. By the late 19th century to about the 1930s or 40s, the climate begins to change nationally with the influx of European Jews, rise of American nativism, and anti-immigrant legislation. A few years prior to the really late 19th century, in 1882, the synagogue was built. And it became clearly a home for Jewish residents and these Jewish families and their offsprings, now multi-generational offsprings. If you have 10 or 12 children, you know, you have a lot of offspring that goes down the line, and therefore it's really good to have a place where you can bring them all together. So the synagogue was built and opened its doors in 1882. In 1902, 20 years later, the federal government demanded the property on which the synagogue sat on 2nd and Market Streets and offered the congregation $10,000. The ostensible reason was that the government needed that land for a larger post office. However, extensive tracts of land were still available in Charlottesville, raising questions about the primary motivations. The offer of $10,000 caused dissension and division within the community, but eventually the synagogue accepted the offer. The trustees accepted the offer. The synagogue was moved, they claim, brick by brick. I don't know quite how they did that, but brick by brick, 1 block to its current location, and reopened in 1904. The rededication was reported in detail in the Daily Progress. The same day that Bernard Oberdorfer and Sons, the rededication was on the same day that Bernard Oberdorfer and Sons took out a full-page ad announcing a dissolution sale of their store. Isaac Letterman and Bernard Oberdorfer, the original trustees of the Jewish cemetery and the synagogue, both died on July 5th, 1905. The moving of the synagogue, the liquidation of the Oberdorfer store, and the deaths of the original trustees marked the turn from 19th to 20th century Charlottesville.